The air in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the summer of 1944 was thin, sharp, and laced with the dust of secrets. Below the majestic peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, in a high-altitude crucible of genius and paranoia, the greatest minds of the Western world were building a god. They called the whole operation the sprawling network of laboratories, production facilities, and housing tracts hidden behind layers of armed guards and classified memos, the Manhattan Project. Its product, the atomic bomb. At the epicenter of this hidden world was Site Y, a sprawling, jerry-built campus carved out of a former boys' school on an isolated mesa. Here, in labs hastily constructed from clapboard and concrete, the atmosphere crackled with a unique blend of intellectual fervor and existential dread. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project's mercurial director, walked the dusty paths like a gaunt, chain-smoking prophet, wrestling the physics of the subatomic world into a usable weapon. But there was a ghost in this machine, a perfectly placed, almost invisible man whose loyalty was not to the flag flying over Site Y, but to a radical, global ideology he believed superseded all nations. His name was Theodore Hall. He was barely 19 years old, a boy genius from a comfortable middle-class background in New York, a prodigy plucked from Harvard and Chicago for his astounding grasp of neutron physics. He was the youngest senior scientist on the entire project, unassuming, quiet, with a shock of sandy hair and a pair of spectacles that made him look less like a world-altering spy and more like a diligent student preparing for a final exam. He was, in short, a perfect cipher. Hall's workspace was critical, the experimental section of the site, where the terrifying dance of fast neutrons was being mapped. Specifically, he was involved in crucial tests known as implosion hydrodynamics, the fiendishly difficult process required to compress a core of plutonium precisely and symmetrically enough to trigger a sustained chain reaction, the very heart of the Fat Man bomb that would ultimately obliterate Nagasaki. He knew the bomb's DNA. On a sweltering July day, just weeks before the Trinity test, Hall made a decision that would haunt American security for decades. He was scheduled for a rare short leave to visit his pregnant wife, Joan, who was living in New York. The protocol for departure was tight: a full security briefing, a signed oath of silence, and a military escort to the railhead. What the military police did not know was that beneath Hall's loose-fitting tweed jacket, against his ribcage, secured with adhesive tape, was a roll of microfilm. This was not a few scribbled notes or a diagram. It was a complete, highly technical breakdown of the plutonium bomb. The complex shape of the lens molds, the critical mass calculations, and the precise velocity of the neutron initiator. It was the entire blueprint for Armageddon, miniaturized onto a small, easily concealable spool of cellulose. New York City in 1944 was a blur of wartime energy, a world away from the silent mesas of New Mexico. Theodore Hall arrived by train, a nervous bundle of brilliance and conviction. His destination was not his wife's apartment, but a specific, dreary address on the Lower East Side, the apartment of a Harvard classmate and fellow Communist Party member, Seville Sachs. Sachs, a lanky, artistic soul, with none of Hall's scientific rigor, but all of his political zeal, was the courier. The exchange was stunningly simple and quick. The two young men met, ostensibly for a casual catch-up, and Hall slipped the microfilm to Sachs. The weight of the moment, the sheer, staggering enormity of what they were doing, was probably lost in the adrenaline and the mundane setting. They were passing the most guarded technological secret on Earth over a chipped Formica table. Sachs's instructions were equally simple, passed down from the party's shadowy network: find the Soviet consulate.
This single, brazen act of espionage was completely detached from the activities of the more famous Soviet spy, Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist working at Los Alamos. Fuchs, a disciplined operative handled by professional NKVD agents, was under intermittent suspicion. Theodore Hall, the American boy wonder, was not. He was an ideological volunteer, a ghost who walked freely because his very existence as a threat was unimaginable to the security apparatus. Hall's motivation, as he later articulated it in private, was rooted in a desperate, almost naive conviction that the United States should not possess a monopoly on such a weapon. He believed that only a balance of terror could prevent a unilateral American first strike and ensure a more peaceful, socialist-led world order. His action was a profound, world-altering act of political idealism and staggering scientific betrayal. The microfilm reached Moscow within weeks. The Soviets, who had been struggling to piece together a coherent nuclear program, suddenly had the key. The alchemist of the canyon had delivered the fire. The bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, ending the war and beginning the atomic age. In the United States, a period of triumphalism mixed with a deep, isolating fear set in. America had the bomb, and therefore America was safe. This hubristic belief was the perfect shield for Theodore Hall. For the next 5 years, Theodore Hall continued his brilliant, unassuming career. He returned to his studies, received his Ph.D., and became a highly respected geophysicist, moving to Cambridge, England, to continue his groundbreaking, non-military research. He was an American success story, the future of science. In the shadows, however, the American and British intelligence services were grappling with an uncomfortable truth. The Soviets had detonated their first atomic device in August 1949, far, far earlier than any intelligence estimate predicted. The 5-year gap the U.S. had banked on had shrunk to 4 years. Someone, somewhere, had talked. The net first caught Fuchs. His arrest in 1950, followed by his confession, was a seismic shock to the security establishment. The spy was identified, his handlers known, and the damage assessed. It was immense, but seemingly contained. What the FBI and MI5 did not know was that the intelligence Fuchs provided, though vast, was secondary. The Soviet bomb, known as First Lightning, was an almost perfect copy of the American Fat Man bomb, thanks primarily to the schematics provided by the boy genius Theodore Hall. Hall's work had been more timely and more complete. It wasn't until a meticulous, soul-crushing analysis of decoded Soviet cables, a top-secret, long-running project known as Venona, that the true extent of the damage began to emerge. The cables, wartime messages that the NSA spent decades decrypting, mentioned a Los Alamos source codenamed Mlad, Russian for young. In 1950, as the FBI prepared to close the file on atomic espionage, the Venona analysts delivered their chilling conclusion. Mlad was Theodore Hall. The shock was paralyzing. They had caught Fuchs, but the younger, more devastating spy had been living a charmed life, undetected, for half a decade. The astonishing part of the story had just begun, because what happened next was a 5-year internal security war, a terrifying dance of surveillance, psychological pressure, and legal maneuvering, where the U.S. government, paralyzed by the enormity of its security failure, deliberately chose not to arrest the man they knew was the greatest atomic spy in American history, allowing him to walk free. And while they pursued the old betrayal, the stage was already being set for the next, far more terrifying act: the race for the hydrogen bomb, a weapon of apocalyptic power, and a new, shadowy network of leaks that would threaten to push the world past the point of no return.
The detonation of the Soviet bomb in 1949 did more than just shatter American military confidence. It ignited a furious, terrifying debate at the highest levels of government and within the scientific community. Should the United States now build the hydrogen bomb? The atomic bomb was an act of terrible genius. The super was an act of scientific blasphemy. While the fission bombs dropped on Japan derived their energy from splitting atoms, nuclear fission, the super bomb would use a fission device as a trigger to force light elements, isotopes of hydrogen, to fuse, mimicking the power source of the sun. The theoretical yield was not measured in kilotons or thousands of tons of TNT, but in megatons or millions of tons of TNT. An H-bomb could, theoretically, wipe a city off the map with a single strike, leaving a crater measured in miles. The moral opposition was led, surprisingly, by J. Robert Oppenheimer and his colleagues on the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC. Oppenheimer, haunted by his role in creating the A-bomb, now argued vehemently against the super. The super, he wrote in a secret GAC report, is a weapon which we do not think we or the world should have. He and his colleagues considered it a weapon of genocide, a tool so destructive it transcended any rational military or political goal. They proposed a path of strategic restraint, arguing that America's massive stockpile of A-bombs was already sufficient deterrence. Standing against this moral argument was the iron will of Edward Teller, the Hungarian-born physicist widely credited as the father of the H-bomb. Teller was a man driven by a profound, almost messianic certainty that the Soviet threat was existential. To Teller, Oppenheimer's moralizing was not merely naive, it was treasonous. He feared a world where the Soviets possessed a weapon the U.S. had voluntarily foregone. This scientific rivalry was not merely academic, it was a psychological war for the soul of American defense policy. The tipping point came with the direct intervention of President Harry S. Truman. Shaken by the Soviet A-bomb and pressured by staunch Cold Warriors, Truman issued a secret, fateful directive in January 1950. I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen or superbomb. The decision was made. The United States was now committed to building a weapon that threatened the very future of the planet. And in this desperate race, the security apparatus was once again dangerously distracted. They were still hunting the ghost of the A-bomb, Theodore Hall, while the blueprints for the H-bomb were being drawn up by a whole new cohort of scientists. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation into Theodore Hall, codenamed MLAD, was an agonizing exercise in paralysis. Following the Venona decrypts, the Bureau had irrefutable evidence of his 1944 betrayal. Yet arresting him posed a unique and devastating political problem. If Hall were arrested and tried, the government would have to reveal how they knew, by presenting the Venona cables as evidence. To do so would compromise the entire Venona project, alerting the Soviets that their top-secret communication codes had been broken and read for years.
The vast, flowing river of Soviet intelligence, which was still providing critical active intelligence in the 1950s, would instantly dry up. The choice was horrific. Prosecute an undeniable traitor and lose the single greatest source of Cold War intelligence, or let a master spy walk free to protect the source. Under the direct, secret orders of Attorney General J. Howard McGrath and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, the decision was made to do nothing. They could not risk Venona. Theodore Hall, now living a quiet, intellectually rich life in Cambridge, England, was placed under intensive, constant surveillance. The FBI files on him grew thicker than a phone book, meticulously documenting his chess games, his lectures, his family picnics. The purpose of this surveillance was not to gather evidence for a prosecution, they already had the evidence, but to ensure he made no new contact with Soviet intelligence, and that he could be instantly neutralized if the Cold War turned hot. This period was a nightmare of psychological warfare for Hall. He knew, or at least suspected, he was being watched. His life became a careful, constrained performance of normalcy, constantly wondering if the quiet knock on the door would finally come. The U.S. government, in turn, suffered the indignity of knowing a major spy was free, his guilt suppressed by the higher calculus of national security. The whole operation was a hidden, 7-year-long game of chicken that never resolved itself in a court of law.
As the United States raced toward the H-bomb, the scientific team at Los Alamos and its satellite labs swelled again. And just as the A-bomb project had been compromised, so too was the Super. The shadow of Theodore Hall, though neutralized, proved to be an ominous prologue to a second, far more mysterious series of leaks. The Super's success hinged on a concept developed by teller and mathematician Stanislaw Ulam, known as the Teller-Ulam configuration. This breakthrough, finalized in 1951, elegantly solved the engineering problem of compressing the fusion fuel. It was a completely new, highly classified concept, a two-stage weapon using radiation pressure to achieve compression. Yet, once again, the Soviets achieved the H-bomb almost concurrently with the Americans. The U.S. detonated its first true thermonuclear device, Ivy Mike, in November 1952. The Soviets followed in August 1953 with their own design, the Sloika, and by 1955 they had perfected their own Teller-Ulam-like configuration. The gap, once again, was negligible. This speed could not be fully explained by the information Hall or Fuchs had provided, as their leaks predated the crucial Teller-Ulam breakthrough. This suggested a horrifying, still unsolved possibility. There was a second, later spy, or even an entire network, who had compromised the H-bomb's secrets. The government's public focus remained fixed on the convicted, executed, and sensationalized Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who provided almost no scientific intelligence compared to Hall or Fuchs. Meanwhile, the true ghosts remained hidden. The full, shocking truth of the H-bomb leak pointed to a complex web of scientific idealists, political radicals, and sheer technical brilliance within the Soviet program, which some historians now believe was fed by another unidentified American scientist who saw the superbomb as a final, terrifying deterrent that no one nation should monopolize. The story, spanning 2 decades and 3 presidents, was no longer just about theft. It was about the cascading failures of security, the paralyzing choices of intelligence, and the moral compromises made by American scientists who felt compelled to sabotage their own nation's technological dominance in a desperate, ultimately futile attempt to save the world from itself. The cold heart of fire was now beating, and the world was locked in a thermonuclear embrace from which it could never fully escape. The narrative would continue, detailing the destruction of Oppenheimer by his political rivals, the relentless pursuit of the second H-bomb spy, the scientific breakthroughs and terrifying tests in the Pacific, and the long-term, astonishing fates of the compromised individuals like Theodore Hall and Edward Teller, who both lived into old age, carrying their world-changing secrets to the grave.
The shock waves from the Soviet bomb and the subsequent discovery of spies like Fuchs and Hall had a predictable and devastating effect on American politics. They fueled a rabid internal witch hunt. The ultimate target was not a hidden operative like Hall, but the most visible symbol of the atomic era's moral ambivalence and its security failures, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer's opposition to the superbomb, Chapter 4, had earned him powerful enemies, primarily Edward Teller and AEC Chairman Lewis Strauss, a staunch Cold Warrior obsessed with security and suspicious of the intellectual elite. To Strauss and Teller, Oppenheimer's high-minded appeals for restraint were not just policy disagreements. They were evidence of a deep-seated disloyalty, a softness on communism that had allowed the spies to flourish under his nose at Los Alamos. In 1953, Lewis Strauss, with the covert support of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, engineered a spectacular political takedown. He ordered a security hearing to review Oppenheimer's suitability for continued access to classified information, effectively putting the father of the atomic bomb on trial. The hearing was not a criminal trial, but a quasi-judicial inquest conducted behind closed doors, shrouded in Cold War secrecy. It was a masterpiece of political maneuvering designed to destroy Oppenheimer's reputation and silence the scientific voice of dissent against the H-bomb. The proceedings of the Oppenheimer Security Board hearings in 1954 revealed the astonishing extent to which the government was willing to twist the truth and compromise ethical standards to achieve a political end. The government's case rested not on any specific act of betrayal, but on Oppenheimer's past associations with communist friends and students in the 1930s, and, most damningly, his famously shifting, evasive, and often contradictory testimony about the 1943 Chevalier incident, where an old friend had sounded him out about sharing information with the Soviets. During the hearing, Oppenheimer was subjected to grueling 9-hour interrogations designed to highlight his perceived evasiveness and arrogance. Unbeknownst to his lawyers, the FBI had illegally tapped Oppenheimer's phones for years, and the Security Board had access to raw, unvetted FBI surveillance files that Oppenheimer was not allowed to see or challenge. But the most astonishing moment came from his own former colleagues. Edward Teller, driven by his conviction that the H-bomb was necessary and that Oppenheimer stood in the way, delivered the coup de grace. When asked if he believed Oppenheimer was a security risk, Teller stated, chillingly, "I feel that I would like to see the vital interests of this country in the hands of a person whom I understand better and therefore trust more. In this respect, I have confidence in a great many people, but I would feel personally more secure if the vital interests of the country were in other hands." This single statement, delivered under oath, was not an accusation of treachery, but a profound vote of no confidence that nevertheless sealed Oppenheimer's fate. Teller used the weapon of trust to destroy the man who had once been his collaborator and friend. In June 1954, the Security Board delivered its astonishing verdict. While they found Oppenheimer to be loyal, they recommended that his security clearance not be reinstated. Their decision was a masterpiece of Cold War doublespeak. They condemned him not for disloyalty, but for what they termed fundamental defects in his character, including his lack of candor, his past associations, and his obstructionist attitude toward the superbomb project. The AEC swiftly ratified the decision. The result was instantaneous and total. Oppenheimer, the intellectual titan who had orchestrated the creation of the world's first nuclear weapons, was stripped of his influence, his access, and his voice in American defense policy. The true, horrifying political utility of this maneuver was twofold. It justified the H-bomb. The removal of its chief intellectual opponent cleared the way for the unrestrained development of the thermonuclear arsenal, validating Teller and Strauss. It served as a warning. It sent a deafening message to every scientist and intellectual in America. Dissent is not tolerated. In the new age of the superbomb, conscience was a security risk. If the father of the atomic bomb could be destroyed, no one was safe. The destruction of Oppenheimer achieved what the successful espionage of Theodore Hall and Klaus Fuchs could not. It permanently fractured the relationship between the American scientific community and the government, driving the most brilliant minds away from defense work and silencing the internal moral critique of the arms race at the exact moment the superbomb made that critique most necessary. While Theodore Hall lived out his life in freedom under perpetual surveillance, and Edward Teller became a celebrated hawk, Robert Oppenheimer lived the last 12 years of his life in intellectual exile, a broken man who had witnessed his creation turn against him and his own conscience used as a political weapon. The cold heart of fire was now fully lit, fueled by suspicion, betrayal, and the silencing of the very people who best understood the danger. The only thing left to do was to detonate the ultimate weapon, an act that would define the true, terrifying scale of the secrets that had been stolen and betrayed. The narrative would continue with the first thermonuclear tests, the horrific scale of the superbomb, and the final astonishing truth about Theodore Hall's long, unpunished life and the lasting legacy of security versus freedom. The resulting explosion was unlike anything witnessed by humanity. The yield was an astonishing 10.4 megatons, nearly 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The flash of light was a blinding, instantaneous replica of the sun, visible for hundreds of miles. The heat was so intense it vaporized the metal shack and the surrounding scientific equipment instantly. But the most astonishing, terrifying consequence was on the physical world. The thermoblast and ensuing shockwave completely obliterated the island of Ilugalab. Where the land had been, there was now a crater 1 mile wide and 164 feet deep. The island had literally vanished from the face of the earth, replaced by a churning radioactive lagoon. The resulting mushroom cloud climbed to 57,000 feet in 90 seconds, eventually peaking at 135,000 feet, over 25 miles, and spreading a plume of deadly radioactive coral dust across thousands of square miles of the Pacific. The message to the world was unequivocal. The age of strategic deterrence had ended. The age of mutually assured destruction, MAD, had begun. The stolen secrets of the A-bomb had merely been the prelude to this apocalyptic capability.
The successful test of Ivy Mike intensified the paranoia about leaks, leading the government to double down on secrecy and, more astonishingly, deception. When the Soviets detonated their own true thermonuclear weapon, the RDS-6, or Sloika, in August 1953, it confirmed that the secrets of the superbomb had also been compromised, or that Soviet physicists were simply as brilliant and driven as their American counterparts. To accelerate the U.S. program and develop a deliverable weapon, Edward Teller's team switched from the cumbersome liquid fuel used in Mike to a dry fuel, lithium deuteride. This breakthrough allowed the creation of a compact air-deployable H-bomb. The test of this new deliverable weapon, Castle Bravo, in March 1954, was intended to be the final triumphant flourish of American technological dominance. Castle Bravo was supposed to yield about 6 megatons,
Due to an error in calculating the interaction of the lithium isotopes, the bomb exploded with a force of 15 megatons, the largest nuclear device ever detonated by the U.S. The explosion was a catastrophe. The unexpected massive yield caused a catastrophic dispersal of radioactive fallout far beyond the predicted safety zone. The fallout plume drifted eastward, contaminating large sections of the Marshall Islands, and, infamously, blanketing the Japanese fishing boat, the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon, poisoning its crew and reigniting global outrage against nuclear testing. The government's response was an astonishing attempt to suppress the scale of the disaster and the security implications. They initially described the device as experimental and downplayed the danger to the Marshallese population, many of whom were forced to evacuate their irradiated home islands. The lies were a desperate attempt to maintain the narrative of technological superiority and internal security, even as the sky rained deadly, invisible dust. The true, deep historical irony was clear. The fear of a stolen secret had led to a relentless drive for ever greater destructive power, which culminated in a massive, uncontrolled disaster that the U.S. government then attempted to cover up. The greatest danger was no longer just the enemy, but the uncontrolled power of the weapons themselves, and the institutional deceit required to sustain the arms race. While the world obsessed over Oppenheimer's fate and the terrifying new megaton tests, the actual successful spy, Theodore Hall, was living an extraordinary, unpunished life. Following his move to the UK in the early 1960s, he pursued a distinguished and pioneering career in geophysics. He conducted groundbreaking work on electron probe microanalysis, significantly advancing the field of cell biology. He became a respected figure at the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University, a bastion of British science. Throughout these decades, the FBI kept his file active, but the decision to avoid a public prosecution held firm. The cost of exposing Venona was simply too high. Hall knew he was under surveillance, but the years of waiting had passed and the threat of arrest faded as the Cold War stabilized into a state of tense coexistence. Hall only publicly acknowledged his role in the espionage network once, late in his life. In the 1990s, when the full extent of the Venona decrypts was finally declassified, reporters traced the codename Mlad back to him. When confronted, Hall, then in his 70s, confirmed the historical fact of his actions, but maintained his deep philosophical convictions. He stated that he was motivated by a desire to ensure a balance of power, a mutual deterrence that he believed was necessary to prevent the U.S. from using the atomic bomb again. He never expressed regret for the act of espionage itself, only for the methods used. The astonishing truth for the U.S. audience was this: the man who gave the Soviets the A-bomb blueprint, ensuring the creation of the world-ending arsenal, not only evaded justice, but went on to have a long, productive, and celebrated career. He died in 1999, an unindicted, unapologetic revolutionary who had single-handedly tipped the scales of the Cold War power. The story of the Cold Heart of Fire, therefore, is not merely a tale of espionage and brilliant physics. It is a profound historical testament to the complex, contradictory morality of the atomic age. It is a story where the most devastating traitor walked free, the most principled scientist was destroyed, and the ultimate weapon was created not by technological necessity, but by a chain reaction of fear, ideological conviction, and astounding security failure.
The decades following the thermonuclear tests and the destruction of Oppenheimer settled into a grim stalemate known as the Cold War. But even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the final, astonishing truths of the nuclear espionage saga remain buried deep within the archives of the U.S. government, awaiting a reckoning. That reckoning began in 1995, with the declassification of the long-secret Venona cables. For 50 years, the FBI and NSA had held the secret of Theodore Hall's treachery close, preferring to tolerate a free man to preserve a unique intelligence source. When the decrypts were finally released, the public and the historical community were stunned. The cables provided undeniable evidence not only of the famous spy, Klaus Fuchs, but also confirmed the existence of Mlad, Theodore Hall, the young Harvard graduate whose timely and precise information had jump-started the Soviet atomic program. The revelation was a final seismic shock to the American psyche, dwarfing the sensationalized trials of the past. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who had been executed in 1953 for providing information far less critical than Hall's, became tragic symbols of a misplaced, hysterical national vengeance. Theodore Hall, the real atomic architect of the Soviet bomb, had enjoyed a long, productive life and was now living quietly in Cambridge, England, a retired, respected scientist. Hall, aging and suffering from Parkinson's disease and cancer, the latter possibly a result of his plutonium work at Los Alamos, was finally forced to confront his past. He never fully confessed on the record, maintaining a lifelong, guarded ambiguity, but he acknowledged the truth of the accusations. His statement, delivered through his family, crystallized the astonishing moral paradox of the age. I decided to give the information because an American monopoly was a very dangerous thing. I did not see myself as a traitor. I saw myself as someone who was helping to bring the world into a state of balance. He died on November 1, 1999, an unpunished, unapologetic atomic spy. His death closed the loop on the cold heart of fire, leaving a chilling question. Did his act of espionage, driven by an ideological faith in balance, actually succeed in preventing nuclear war, or did it merely ensure that the inevitable conflict would be a terrifying, global stalemate? The final enduring consequence of the espionage and the subsequent political witch hunts was the permanent fracturing of trust between the American government and its scientific elite. The public humiliation of J. Robert Oppenheimer in 1954 achieved the political goals of the superbomb's advocates. It silenced the most potent moral voice against the relentless escalation of the arms race. It taught generations of American scientists a brutal lesson. Your intellect is required for the state, but your conscience is not. If the father of the bomb could be exiled for his opinions, any working scientist risked their career by questioning policy. The golden age of the scientific advisor, when figures like Oppenheimer held a near priestly sway over policy, ended abruptly. Scientists retreated from the public sphere, focusing on pure research, creating a subtle but profound gap between those who created the weapons and those who commanded them. Meanwhile, Edward Teller, the hawkish architect of the H-bomb and Oppenheimer's nemesis, was initially hailed as a victor, but his betrayal of Oppenheimer at the security hearing, the use of character assassination to win a policy fight, earned him the lasting scorn of the majority of the scientific community. He became a lonely, controversial figure, permanently stained by the ethical cost of his ambition. The historical reality of the cold heart of fire is a narrative of profound complexity, a cautionary tale that continues to define America's relationship with power, secrecy, and conscience. The legacy of the espionage is not just the Soviet bomb, but the institutionalized paranoia it fostered. It was this fear of the invisible enemy that allowed men like Louis Strauss to destroy Oppenheimer's career. It was this fear that justified the continuous, terrifying escalation from the small, city-killing A-bomb to the monstrous, island-vaporizing H-bomb. In 2022, nearly 7 decades after the revocation, the U.S. Department of Energy formally nullified the 1954 decision against Oppenheimer, acknowledging the process had been deeply flawed and politically motivated, a final, official admission of a historical wrong. But this bureaucratic correction came far too late to restore the man or repair the damage done to the national conversation about nuclear ethics.
Today, the world lives with the ultimate weapon whose creation was accelerated by a complex chain of youthful idealism, deep-seated political conviction, and astounding security and competence. The true, astonishing story of the atomic spies, led by the unindicted boy genius Theodore Hall, proves that the most devastating secrets in history are not just those held under lock and key, but the ones guarded within the cold heart of an idealist. A heart that was willing to betray his country to save the world, whether or not the world was ready to be saved. The fire he unleashed, the thermonuclear dawn, still casts its long, complex shadow over the American century, a perpetual reminder that the greatest threats often come not from the shadows of a foreign enemy, but from the terrifyingly rational calculations made in the clear light of conscience.